Tsahi, thanks for joining me for another industry analysis segment. Great to have you here as always.
Same here. Always fun, Arin.
Let's get right to it. You posted the question on LinkedIn recently, is winter coming for WebRTC? What did you mean by that?
Well, do you want to share that so I actually remember what I did there? Okay, so if you think about it, WebRTC started as a kind of an open source project, community, whatever. Yes, it was Google, but it took something that was up until that point proprietary and made that part of the larger industry that we have. Before that, if you had to do something with voice and video over the web, you had to go purchase a lot of components and then build something with them. Open source, not open source, that was the actual thing that you had to do. When WebRTC came out, first of all, it was open source. It was part of the browser. And we had codecs that were royalty-free as well. It started with VP8 and Opus, and now we've got Opus, VP8, VP9, and AV1. I'm ignoring the paid-for codecs. What you start seeing in the last few years is that the innovations and additions that come into WebRTC might or might not be part of WebRTC itself. Okay, if I give an example, Google has a new codec called Lyra, low bandwidth. Yes, it is open source. It's not part of WebRTC. You can hook it up with WebRTC. Microsoft has a low bandwidth codec as well called Satin. Amazon has their own spiel there. Cisco has their own new AI codec for audio. Meta has their NMLO codec. So it seems like we're back to a kind of a war, an armament war around codecs that might or not be part of WebRTC at the end of it. Once someone wins, we might end up with codecs that are not aligned or that not everyone has access to. And we see it in other places as well. So a lot of the focus now is around how do I use machine learning, but outside of WebRTC, because we don't know, the excuse is we don't know exactly what the use cases are going to be. So let's give the power to the developers. But this power also means that nothing is going to trickle back into WebRTC itself. So whatever investments people made is theirs and theirs alone. It's both good and bad, depending where you are. So that was the kind of things that I was alluding to.
Okay. So are we going back to the bad old world of browser incompatibilities then with a trend like this? Is that a reasonable fear for me to have?
It's a good question. I think the answer is no. We're going to the, let's say, dark ages of WebRTC when we had Google and maybe Chrome and maybe a bit of Firefox, but Safari was backwards because people are going to use also things like web transport and web codecs, and these aren't quite standard across browsers yet.
Right.
But we're still going to be able to use all these things in the browser. The thing is this. Let's fast forward 5 years from now. We're going to use probably mostly VP9 or AV1. I'd like to think that it's going to be AV1 5 years into the future. I think it would be too early to say that everything is AV1, but we will have a lot of AV1. What would be the audio codec exactly at that point? Would that still be Opus, or would that be something different? Would that something that is different be proprietary per vendor? Because now I can build it using WebAssembly and stitch it into WebRTC with insertable strings and other curses that we now have in WebRTC that enable us to do these things. Because if I can do that, then you don't need to worry from the browser perspective, but you need to worry from connectivity. Okay, we have now the DMA, the Digital Marketing Act, or whatever that is in Europe, that essentially forces all large social networks to be able to open up their networks for others. We start seeing them doing that. Meta came out with how you connect to WhatsApp and to our other domains with technical details. Likely, they would end up opening up the voice and video part using WebRTC, probably first because they support it, and second because, well, it's the only reasonable thing to do on a browser. So this is going to be a mechanism to interact across different networks, but would that be how inwardly things would be used, or would that become the lowest common denominator? So let's think about it this way, okay? in a way, I think that WebRTC is becoming so good that it's going to be the G711 of the voice over IP world. It's going to be just workable, but that's about it. Nobody will want to use it, but it's always there. It's ubiquitous.
Mhm.
And I think that's where my worry is, that the big vendors are going to do a lot of improvements, but they're not going to give them to others or expose them to others, just to have the differentiation that they need. And this is just market realities. It's not like this is what I want or this is what I preach, or it is what it is.
So it fits a little bit within, it sounds like, this larger trend or parallel path, at least, of unbundling versus WebRTC, right? And so your concern is not that, correct me if I'm wrong here, it's not that WebRTC is going to go away. It's more like it's always there. It's ubiquitous. It's this great base level, but it becomes a little bit stale in comparison, perhaps, to some of the capabilities that proprietary tools would have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, you said it a lot better than I could.
Well, and so what do you see as kind of the impact for that on, say, those of us who work with open source or proprietary APIs and building more custom applications and use cases around that, perhaps we have to, is it like an issue where if you're using an open source library, you're never going to quite achieve the same level of quality that maybe, could happen in a FaceTime call or something more proprietary because they're not using open standards, right? And so we just have to accept that, or?
Yes. The answer is yes. And I guess the reason is that now the current competition is not about the technology. If you look just at the market at large, at the technology market, it's not that I have better code than you have.
Mm-hmm.
It's that I have more data than you have. Hence, my AI algorithms are better trained and more honed and fine-tuned than yours.
Right.
Okay, so the bigger the companies, the more fine-tuned I can make my algorithms. And you can't, because, especially you, because you're an outsourcing vendor, you do work for others,
right,
and you move from one product to another. So you accumulate knowledge and know-how and access to technologies, but not to data. You'll know how to process data, but you can't bring data to the next customer because,
it's not ours, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, the data stays as an asset with each of those large companies, and smaller startups are not going to have access to that sort of asset.
Yeah. And then it becomes always a question, would the company come and open and expose that data so others can use it for training? Mm-hmm. Maybe, not everything, some of it. Right. Would we have open source alternatives? Today we have Whisper if we want to do speech to text, which is great. Instead of going and buying it from a Google or an Amazon or Microsoft or whatever. So we can go and use open source. Is that as good? In the case of Whisper, I understand that it is. In other cases, I don't know.
Yeah.
Is Crisp AI, which are doing noise suppression, better than trying to use NR noise? Probably. Okay, if you're using an NR noise, you need a lot of training data, which Crisp simply brought and built for their own use case. Again, I don't begrudge them. It's their business model and people buy that, so it makes sense for them. It would make sense for me if I would have done that, by the way. But I think the incentive for the large companies in the industry is to put things outside of WebRTC now, as opposed to in the past.
Yeah.
The only way for that to change might be if Google decides to open up WebRTC in ways that it haven't done until today, which means letting in more for the larger vendors to come and join in the actual development and in the direction that WebRTC itself is taking. Otherwise, it's going to stay like, we need it for Chrome and we need it for Google Meet, so let's do the minimal must here and put everything that we need inside Google Meet because we have to compete against the rest of the market, and we don't want them to use our technology against us, which is likely a discussion that has been going on inside Google for the last 10 years of why are they putting things inside WebRTC.
Right.
It would be nicer to see this become a Linux than something else in the open source community.
Well, and so my last question here then for you is around open source. Is there an opportunity here for open source projects to help bridge that gap, or perhaps they face the same problem if they don't have the data as an asset either?
No, I think here it's not the case of data, it's the case of access.
Mm-hmm.
The access to WebRTC belongs to the browser vendors, period.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there are the implementations of WebRTC, but none of them will be ever as big or as important as libWebRTC, because
Right.
libWebRTC exists in all browsers. And the one that owns and controls and decides what goes into libWebRTC is Google at the end of the day. It's good that it's Google, not someone like Apple, by the way, based on how the companies operate and work.
Yeah.
But I think that at this point we can come and say, well, we might want something a bit better. Mm-hmm. Not like someone other than Google, but a bit different way of thinking of what needs to be done or not in WebRTC itself and the governance and around libWebRTC itself.
Oh, makes sense. All right. Well, thank you very much, Tsahi. We're out of time for today, but look forward to speaking with you again next month. We'll keep an eye on this industry trend, as with all the others with you. So thanks again for your time, Tsahi. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Arin.